one of the most extraordinary period of my life was in 2013, when I had a major crisis when it came to establishing meaning for life and actions and anything that surrounded me. It was not a neurological problem, it was more a matter of all of a sudden structures that I had believed in and that had supported me in some ways collapsed. And I found myself without points of reference. My old points of reference being disqualified, I think. They're being reduced to very little importance. I realized then that a lot of what we are presented as an image of a reality is a game which is manipulated for certain purposes. And while I've always had a certain a drive, I would say, a pull towards trying to find some kind of authenticity in my life experience, I found myself in a situation where I realized that most of the things that were presented to me were more or less trumpets, and they were presented there because they serve some kind of agenda. So that, for example, I came to the conclusion most art is very little than propaganda. I remember I was in Madrid and I was at the Prado Museum, and I've always very much enjoyed going in a museum and relating to the experience of appreciating art. Because I felt that there was some element of truth in the artistic experience. But I found myself wandering around the corridors of this amazing museum and looking at things on the walls and just not being able to appreciate any of that, because most of it just seemed to, their function seems to simply reinforce a certain narrative, and that narrative didn't necessarily present what I would consider an authentic vision of reality. So I had a pretty bleak time. But as they say, it always gets darker before it gets light, doesn't it? It's always darker before it gets light. And sure enough, only a few weeks later, I had a quite, what I deem a quite extraordinary experience. I was walking around the streets of London, where I spent most of my time, and all of a sudden, thoughts in my mind stopped. Now, when I say thoughts in my mind stop, I mean that the constant narrative that goes on in our minds, that tells me what I'm doing, who I am, that judges every moment of my life, that it sort of like chronicles my daily activities, just stopped. It became silent, and I was able to relate to my experience without the necessity of mediating it through words. And it was a pretty exhilarating experience. Now, I don't know if it has any connection with this, but there is a wonderful TED talk by Jill Bolt Taylor, I think is the name, about, it's called, A Flash of Insight? No, I can't remember what it's called. It's about her experience of a stroke. She's a neurologist and she experienced a stroke. And what she talks about was the two different parts of the brain. So I'm not sure whether what I experienced was a moment of connecting to what they call the right side of the brain, and I'm not sure this model that we have with the right and left side, it's a completely valid model, but for the sake of our conversation and for the sake of communication, I would relate to it in those terms, and the idea that we mostly function on our left brain, which is analytical and verbal, and we tend not to relate not to perceive with our right brain, which is more analogical and relates to shape and space in a different way. There was a famous book called Drawing with the Right Side of the Brain, I think, which took this in consideration. But the point was that I was there, I was walking around London, and there was no noise in my head. And I was still relating to everything that was going on around me, but in a more intense, somewhat deeper way, more immediate. It was a more immediate way of experiencing what I was doing and what was happening to me, and it was really wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And then while I was walking around, I was thinking, you know, the moment in the Matrix when Neo starts seeing the codes. Well, I didn't see the codes, but it was sort of similar insofar that sorry, I remember, it's A Stroke of Insight, I think, is the TED Talk, which is highly recommended, by the way. There was an element of seeing reality in a different way, because words are symbolic. Words that say, you know, when we have this narrative, which, you know, kind of thinking, when we go around just thinking and perceiving things, labeling them, even in a non-completely aware way, we are somehow projecting rather than perceiving. And so there was this different way of connecting with the reality that surrounded me. And at some point, I don't think everything had different lights or anything like that, but it was a more it's very difficult to put into words. It was a smoother way of relating to what was happening to me. Crossing the road, just walking around, seeing lights, seeing people. It was just being in some kind of zone. And then I remember I was in Bedford Square, and something happened, and a car passed by, and I was absolutely and completely in that moment. And I wouldn't say reality sort of like opened, but it was certainly a completely different way of perceiving reality. And it was quite wonderful. Now, I call this my moment of enlightenment, which is, well, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek in many ways, but there's a, you know, I've been studying is not the right word, but I've been exploring a lot this concept of enlightenment. We're talking enlightenment in spiritual terms, and what it is and what it means and what it might mean, because this is the problem with words. When we describe experience, we contextualize through a meaning that has certain connotation in our experience. But if we don't have if we don't have the experience that we're trying to relate to through words, there's never a bridge between the experience itself and our understanding of it, because we basically lack the connotations of what the experience is like. So I can read zillions of books on enlightenment and still have no clue of what enlightenment actually is. And then it's the same with love. I find it's the same. You know, we read books about love, and we don't actually know unless you experience it. We experience it on our own skin and flesh and heart. What love means, and in any case it will mean different things for different people, because it's relative to the experience that we know and that we can relate to. So, but I remember just before this happened, I had spoken with a wonderful friend of mine who is a psychologist and a therapist, and I was saying, you know, nothing makes sense at the moment, and I think that I'm either going to become enlightened or going completely mad. And her reply was, don't go mad, just go there and bring it back. And I'm not sure this is what I'm doing, but there certainly was a moment in that experience where I felt that there was a bridge between two different worlds, and that moment gave me some kind of, not so much a key, but an experience that I can relate to then understand other things, and in a way it's easier than to deal with the fact that the fabric of reality as I knew it, as it's presented to us, sort of collapse when you can hold on to something behind it, because you're not left out in the cold with nothing around you. So I don't think I'm an enlightened being in any possible way, but I think enlightenment probably is itself a process, and it's, you know, we have these images of enlightened being, they're there, they're just there, and maybe some people are just there. I think that for most people it's a matter of deepening whatever enlightenment is in terms of the way we relate to our experience and what surrounds us, and step by step. So I always love the expression that, you know, before enlightenment, carry water and chop wood, and after enlightenment, carry water and chop wood. And I think that there's an element of that, which is, you know, life just carries on. It's just that we look at it in a different way, and being able to look at it in a different way allows us to separate from dramas, not all dramas, but you know, some dramas, and allows us to take distance so that we can contemplate a different way of looking at reality, because we don't feel that we have to hold to a certain view of reality, otherwise we will be left with nothing. And then I also feel that in my experience, these elements, these little steps that we do, and it's a journey, and we do one step after the other, and it just deepens and deepens, and bit by bit our way of relating to everything is changed quite dramatically, not necessarily because of one single event, but because of a series of little changes that by adding up change completely the way that we function and the way that we look at things. So my life was never the same after that moment in Bedford Square. And even if I haven't had similar experiences, well, I had other experiences, but perhaps not so strong, I can sometimes recapture that sensation, and I can certainly hold on to the memory of that. And that is something that I can use when I fall back and I'm caught in what I call the game. But that is for another video. So if any of you had a similar experience, please let me know, because I'd be